Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. And over the past year, I've been teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today, our guest is Wendy Sage-Hayward, co-author of Own It, which is a book focused on family business. So Wendy, let's dive in by you telling us about your professional background.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I come from a background of organizational psych and family systems psychology. So I have a master's in family systems psychology, and I also have a master's in the neuroscience of leadership. But my practical experiences, I was Gen 5 in my father's family business, and I'm Gen 1 in my own family business here in British Columbia. And so I've really worked as a consultant my whole career, and I've worked with all sorts of levels within an organization, from a board to the executive team to frontline staff, and all in the area of working with family businesses. I've also had experience working with non-family businesses in the area of organizational change and leadership development and governance. And of course, in families, it's also helping them navigate this journey of continuity. So that's sort of what I do. The other hat that I wear is similar to what you were talking about, Mark, is I'm also an educator. So I work at and I teach at several business schools across Canada and in the US, and all focused on either teaching families who are in business together or teaching advisors who serve families.
So Wendy and I have that in common because I've been working with family businesses for 30 years. And you can write volumes of great stories
Yeah.
from things that you just can't believe that could actually happen in a family business. Why did you and your co-authors write this book?
Well, I think that in the field, and you probably know this given you've been working with family businesses, is the family and the business. There's a lot of attention paid to those in the field, and a lot of, books and articles and materials and resources are available around the family and the business. There's not a lot around ownership. And I kind of became an accidental owner in my dad's family business because my grandmother passed away in the 90s, and then my dad passed away 3 months later. And so transition of ownership hadn't even occurred to my father's generation. And my mother and my sisters and I all became at that stage, it was a trust. And then the trust resolved. It was a last man standing trust, and it dissolved, and then we became a partnership. But learning about ownership it was a daunting task, and there wasn't a lot of resources out there to help us sort of unpack what that meant. And so it was that part of that was my journey of learning about ownership and the importance of ownership. And then, of course, working with families, I think a lot of times what ends up happening is advisors and families think about shareholders, sort of the ownership group, sort of like they think about it in a public company. It's sort of, you don't really have a strong voice. You don't make a lot of decisions. It's really the board and the executive team that make those decisions. But in a family business, that's not really true. Owners and shareholders have a much bigger role and a very important role for the family business in terms of the direction, in terms of setting some of the goals, et cetera. And so helping families understand that. The other piece, and then I'll sort of stop talking here, but the other piece about ownership that is so important is that it's the most complex circle of the three-circle model, right? So it's very technical. It's about shareholders agreements and trusts and estate planning and insurance and risk management and dividends and distributions. It's very technical. And we tend to relegate that in family businesses. We relegate that to our advisors. And yet it's such a critical piece for us to understand because of the implications for not only a current generation, but for continuity in a family business. So we wanted to highlight that. We wanted to sort of put some more understanding out in the field and help families think about it more deeply.
The dissolution rate of family businesses gets greater with each generation.
Yeah.
What are the main reasons that they just, most cases, don't last past 3 generations?
Yes, well, I think that we're also challenging some of that old research, to be honest. I think that some of the research that keeps getting quoted was from the 80s, and it was really not intended to be used in the way that it's being used now. So I think what we're learning is that family businesses actually they last longer than non-family businesses, but also that we do appreciate that the rising generation isn't ready. Sometimes families do have difficulty with communication and trust, and of course the global trends that are facing not just family businesses but non-family businesses as well, all are challenging the continuity process for families. And so being aware of that is super important, so that they can mitigate some of those risks to their succession processes.
Why did you focus on family enterprise ownership over family business ownership, and what's the difference?
Yeah, such a great question, Mark. So I think families and advisors, we tend to focus on transitioning the business. But as families grow, they actually are, many of them have more than one business. They also acquire real estate. They have financial assets. They have heirloom assets that might be the family cottage, or it could be an art collection, or it could be a car collection. So there's so much more. Sometimes they have foundations and they have charitable giving. They might have deferred assets. And they also have non-financial assets. And so all of those pieces make up a family enterprise. It's not just a business. And so when we're thinking about continuity, we want to make sure that we're thinking about all those pieces of a family enterprise, not just the business.
Jay Hughes writes that family businesses in the beginning of your book writes that family businesses have separate and collective capitals. What are they, and are there more important than, or is one more important than others?
Great question. So I think that, we all are aware of the financial capital, but there's four others, right? There's social capital, intellectual capital, human capital, and spiritual capital. And all of those pieces are super important to focus on as we think about continuity. So for example, if we take social capital is all the relationships that the incumbent generation has developed that makes their business successful, whether that's with bankers, whether that's with their customers or suppliers. So for example, when we transitioned from my cousin Rusty, who was the chair of our board for 25 years, to my cousin Kate, who was in generation 4, we needed to make sure the bankers sort of knew Kate and were comfortable with her and they had a relationship with her. So, and the same is with human capital and intellectual capital. The incumbent generation has tremendous knowledge and skill and understanding of how the business works and how the industry works. That needs to transition. That talent, that knowledge, that capability needs to transition to the rising generation. And the values, that's the spiritual capital. So how do the values transition? In my family, we really took care of our community. It was about quality and service. And so again, making sure that those values also transition to the rising generation, not just the financial assets, because that's what makes
Uh,
the business successful.
uh, no question about it. In the book, Jay Hughes mentions the importance of each family member finding, and I'm quoting here, self.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yes. Well, what ends up happening is we can get lost. The family enterprise or the family business is, it's like a time magnet. It's like, he calls it sort of a black hole, and everything kind of gets sucked into it. And what ends up happening is the individuals can get lost in that. And so we want to make sure for, the success and the longevity of a family enterprise, that it's not just a we enterprise, but the me side of it also gets taken care of, that individuals understand what their own interests are, what their goals are, and their aspirations are, so that that doesn't get lost in the mix. And this time magnet and black hole sometimes that the business can be doesn't usurp that. And we try to find some balance there for the me and the we.
What's your definition of an owner's mindset?
So, well, let's break it down a little bit in terms of a mindset itself is a set of beliefs that drive and shape what we do and how we do it and how we engage with the world. So, an owner's mindset is really understanding some key aspects of ownership, which include things like development is a continuous process. And it's not just an individual process, but we need to develop as a collective as well. We need to have shared sort of language and understanding of continuity so that we can have conversations about the challenges that arise around that. We need to be proactive and not just sit back and kind of let continuity happen. We need to be very active in that and intentional about how we do it. We need to have an abundance versus scarcity mentality. So we want to think about actions or activities and roles and responsibilities for many family members to play if they want to. It's not just about the few. And of course, it's this win-win solution. And that comes back to the me and the we, that we want to have outcomes that support both the collective and the individual interests and goals and aspirations. And then, of course, finally, it's about diversity and inclusion and making sure that we honor and truly engage all of the diversity that we have, because we know that when we have diversity, that we make better decisions, that we have better outcomes. And so finding ways to include that so that we're stronger together than we are apart. And I hear families talk about that all the time. So we are stronger together than we are apart because we appreciate the diversity we bring to the table.
What was the biggest surprise you found from writing this book?
Well, probably about the idea of a mindset. I'm not sure that when we started the book, we appreciated the whole mindset approach to being an owner and really understanding that question you just asked, which is what is an owner's mindset? And so the power of that, I think the profound impact of that on the success of a family enterprise, knowing that that mindset drives everything. And so that really underpins the whole approach to the book, is thinking about this mindset that we just talked about.
Is there a difference in how founding family entrepreneurs look at a business compared to founders of non-family businesses?
Well, I think again, it's that appreciating and the drive to offer opportunities for your family. What I see in entrepreneurs who are intentional about having a family business is that they're doing not just doing something for their children, but they're doing something with their children and their family. And that's a very subtle distinction, but a very important one. So it is really about the family and having all boats rise, if you will, to quote Jay Hughes, really creating opportunity with the family to be closer, to be stronger, to be connected, and to have opportunity together.
I came from family business. My father, my uncle, they had a separate family business and so forth. And it used to be that your parents really pressured you to join the family business to
Mm.
take it over. But I found from all the families that I was doing with, that was just the opposite,
Yeah.
that they wanted their kids to make the choice themselves.
Mhm.
And if anything, they kind of pushed back to see if the kid really wanted to be a
Yes.
part of that business,
Yeah.
and they started to think more about all the employees and what the employees had invested in the business. Did you
Mhm.
find that to be the case? A lot of the family businesses now in 2024 think that way?
Absolutely. I think it's much more common to understand. Well, I think that the understanding of the challenge of continuity is more apparent for families. I think there's more research around it. I think there's more understanding around it. And I think families, we're also in a place where we want our kids to do what they want to do. We want them to enjoy life, to be satisfied, to be fulfilled. And so sometimes that might not be the family business. And I think we understand that better than we did in previous generations.
Can you talk about the role of a non-operating owner and how they can help the business?
Yeah. Well, I think that again, what I see more and more happen, especially as you go down in the generations, that you see either some of the kids don't want to be involved in an operating capacity, but they might be involved in a governing capacity. And so you might have some family members who are operating owners, and you might have some that are governing owners or engaged or even passive owners. And their responsibility is about establishing, and helping establish with all the owners and having a collective voice around what's our vision and goals, and how do we put good governance in so we have good decision making, we have good communication going on, good information sharing. How do we identify the benchmarks? Sort of we call it GRIPPLE, which is growth, risk, profitability, and liquidity. How do we define those for our ownership group? And define the relationship between the family, the business, and the ownership. Can family members work in the business, and what's their compensation, and what do we do with profits, et cetera? And then, of course, plan for continuity. So those 5 roles are the role of owners. It's not just non-operating owners, but all owners, and appreciate having the owner hat on, not the necessarily the leadership hat on. And so those conversations for those who work in the business with those who don't can be really, really helpful because they bring that neutral, more neutral perspective, and also the family perspective.
You list six type of owners. What are they and how do you educate each one differently?
Well, and I'm not sure that you do educate them differently. It's a good question, Mark. I think that I just went through some of them, but operating owner, governing owner, there's passive owners, there's an investor owner, there's a proud owner. I mean, some of the proud investor passive might be very nuanced distinctions. But I think if we think about the role of the owner itself, going through some of those responsibilities that I just went through, helping, them make sure that there's basic financial literacy, they have a relationship, they understand their relationship to money, how to make good decisions, how to listen, how to resolve conflicts, how to build trust. All of those things are important drivers for a team of owners, regardless of what kind of owner you are to actually learn to do together. And again, having a baseline of knowledge in all of the ownership groups so that they can have good discussions about some of the things that we were just talking around vision and gripple and relationship between the family, business, and ownership group.
What do the most successful families do to keep the continuity and peace?
Mm. Well, in real estate, it's location, 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 right? In family business, it's communication, communication, communication. And so dealing with the issues, making sure voices are included, being flexible and respectful, putting in place good policies and practices that where everyone has a voice in terms of, understanding what those policies and practices are, but then have good accountability and making sure that families live that. For example, if an employee, family member is not showing up for work and who's slacking off and not, performing, then they need to, be accountable for that and not just let that slide because they're a family member. So it's about communication, it's about these policies and procedures, and it's about making sure there's good accountability.
It used to be only male heirs inherited the top position. How often does this still happen?
Well, I mean, of course, it still happens, but I see it less and less, just as per our conversation, about sort of just a few minutes ago, thinking about families are more cognizant of their heirs and their preparation for stepping into the family business, who's the best person for that. So they're trying to use advisors or implement structures that help them choose the best leader, and sometimes that's not somebody in the family too. So I definitely see it less and less, but it still exists to some degree.
It's funny, in different cultures, people would be surprised that women end up being CEO of pretty sizable companies
Hmm.
outside of the US. In my ex-wife's family, her family had a big family business, and there were four brothers and one sister, and she ended up being CEO in Latin America, where
Yeah,
you would think would be for
right.
sure one of the brothers would have been chosen, but she's been CEO she was the youngest, and she was CEO for 30 years.
Yes. Yeah, which is amazing. I mean, and I do think things are changing. Absolutely, 100%.
In Vietnam, women are hugely, there's no glass ceiling here. They always laugh about the glass ceiling because there's so many women CEOs of all sizes of businesses here. And Vingroup, the largest company in Vietnam, 70,000 employees, all but two of the 21 companies are CEO'd by women.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I just read an article recently about in North America, it's still only about 12% of the top roles are held by women. So it's still low in North America, but I think things are changing. I do.
You write about the importance of transition planning. Please talk about it, especially the selection process.
Yeah, well, transition planning is so critical. And I think families need it's not just about working in the business, it's about working on the business. And that's what transition planning is thinking about, again, selection. It's not just selection for leadership, but it's also how are you going to transition ownership? What does that look like? And how do you do that well? people think sometimes that transition planning is a couple of years because it usually is, there's a precipitating event, right? There's a death or a disability in the incumbent generation from a leadership perspective or an ownership perspective. But really, it can take decades. And so getting started very early, it's one of the reasons, again, why we wanted to write this book is it shouldn't happen, hopefully, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, but really starting very early on to help the rising generation gain the skills, be engaged and generate the love and excitement about the business, if that's their thing. But even if it's not their thing for their career, it could still be something that they own. And how do they do that well with non-family leadership? So again, starting early, the selection process in terms of, from a leadership perspective. So I'll just answer that part of the question. We really think about putting in an objective process to think about where's our business going, and what kind of leadership is going to take us there? What kind of skills do we need in the next leader? And do we have that in the family? And a really important question for families to think about is, do we need family and do we want family leadership? Because for some families, having a family at the helm is critically important because that's where trust sits, is within a family. Other families, they want the best qualified, they want the business maybe has grown to a particular size, so they want to have a non-family family member. So I think, again, where are you going? What kind of skills do we need? Do we want a family leader? And then putting in a selection process to help family members apply for it if they want to be in that role. But also perhaps going external if you need to. But it's got to be an objective process. Everybody's understanding how it's going to work, and there's clarity around what the expectations are of leaders.
For people starting a family business, at what age do you involve the family members? And which you mentioned starting like elementary school?
Absolutely. I mean, we can build that owner's mindset when kids do a lemonade. I don't know if you have children or not, but a lot
I
of
do,
kids.
two daughters. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, I don't know if they ever did a lemonade stand, but it's about helping them think, okay, if this is your little tiny business, you've got some cost of goods sold, then you have, profit, and then you help them understand the equations even at that age. Or let's say you're an auto group, you want to have them come and wash cars, or you want to, if you're real estate development, I have a family where they knocked down one of their buildings. So when they knocked down the buildings, they had the kids there. When they started construction and stuck in the first shovel, the kids were there. When they opened the new building and cut the ribbon, they had the kids there. So helping the kids really appreciate the value of the family business, what it does for the community, what it does for the family, and the employees. So really involving them in lots and lots of different ways. And that's really what the book is about, is looking at each stage of life from, very early all the way up to the senior generation. And what can we learn? How do we build that owner's mindset at every stage of life?
Question from the audience. How do you best manage the following two challenges? External perception, external stakeholders, including employees, customers, and investors, may perceive family businesses differently. Balancing the family's identity with the need to maintain a professional image can be challenging.
Yes.
Adapting to change, family businesses must adapt to changes in the market, technology, and industry trends like any other business. However, entrenched traditions and resistance to change within the family can hinder innovation and growth.
Yes, it absolutely can. And I think it's one of the challenges that families face is you've got the senior generation that can be entrenched in tradition. And this is the way we do things around here in our family, where the rising generation is anxious to change things and to do things differently and to incorporate new technology, for example, or new directions or new demographics. And so it's, again, having good governance in place where hopefully families have the opportunity to do strategic planning together, that owner's responsibility we were talking about. Sometimes having advisors in can help create different kinds of conversations and bridge the gap between generations, because sometimes they can't hear each other. Family dynamics, patterns of communication sometimes get in the way of us hearing each other. So putting good structures in place for innovation and creativity, but also honoring the traditions and asking really important questions like, what are the traditions here that are profoundly important to our family that we don't want to change, and what can we change to adapt to the changing marketplaces, the competition we're facing, the new technologies we're facing, and how do we take advantage of those, so that we can be successful in the future? Because the rising generation is facing very, very different challenges in terms of business, just operations, than the senior generation did, with climate change, with globalization, with economic volatility, with technological advancement. So creating those spaces where families can have that conversation and gently and respectfully challenge one another, to be more innovative is really important. And sometimes you need outsiders to be able to do that in families. Not all families have the capability to hear each other, between generations, or sometimes even within a generation.
I think the outsiders are critical to the future success of any of these family businesses.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Agreed.
Y- You write about diversity and inclusion. You talked about this a little bit earlier,
Yes.
especially when it comes to stepchildren.
Yeah.
How do families handle this positively?
Yeah. Well, it's, again, thinking about some families, stepchildren, especially if they've come into a family very early and very young, they can be included as non-fam or as, sorry, as blood family members, lineal descendants. Sometimes they're not. I think it's about families thinking about, are there differences, being really clear about that, because sometimes the muddiness and the uncertainty is what creates the tension. Where families can sit down and really talk about it in an open manner, there's going to be different perspectives, right? So the stepmom may feel differently than the grandmom about the role of the stepchildren, but trying to be really clear about that, again, speaking about it, talking it through, figuring out what are the differences. Can they work there? Can they be owners? What does their role mean? Where can they have a voice? At minimum, hopefully they can have a voice in the family circle, and perhaps they can be employees. And then, the family's got to decide whether or not they can be inheritors and owners in the future. But sitting down and talking about it, and not making it an undiscussable, but helping really the rising generation understand what their role is and bring some clarity to that.
In the book, you write about the need for what you call learning family. How does that work?
Mhm. Well, again, learning needs to happen not just individually, but it also needs to happen collectively. So getting a family in the room together to have a common language around continuity and understanding. For example, what's the difference between a family business and a family enterprise? What is the three-circle model? And how does that help us understand the complexity of what we're facing as a family business? So when we learn together, it helps create a level playing field for all of us to understand things from the same frameworks, the same thinking frameworks, as I like to call them. And it helps us, have a place for communication and understanding, so that, again, sometimes what I find is families learn really well when they're together, and when they're together with other families. That's some of the best learning that I find, when I can create a room with multiple families in the room. And they learn so much from each other. They understand each other. They, again, have a common language that they're developing to address some of the complexity. Because family businesses might be, the most common form of business around the world, and it's also the most complex form of business. So having good tools, with everyone understanding those tools to be able to talk through some of the complexity, can be super helpful. So that's really what a learning family is being on that collective learning journey around, being a family business, and trying to implement continuity in your family.
When should you get outside mentors to work with members, or should you just use experienced family members? And I'm not talking about the professional advisors like the accountants and
Yeah,
lawyers. I'm talking
right.
about folks to coach them.
Yeah, I think both can be incredibly valuable. So I think the outsiders, I have one family where Gen 3, some of them are being coached by the some of the independent directors on, or some of them have life coaches that are outside of the family enterprise altogether. I think it's invaluable to have that external sort of mentorship. It helps sometimes when family members, again, sort of coming back to what I said a few minutes ago, is that sometimes we don't listen to each other super well within a family. And so having outside mentors can be bring in different experience. It can bring a neutral voice. But I don't want to discount the internal mentors either, because they have a tremendous amount of knowledge and skill and capability to share with the rising generation. We just need to make sure that the senior generation knows how to be a mentor, and not, not a telling person, but really a mentoring person. So that's where learning needs to happen. Even when you're a senior, sort of in your senior years, you need to transition your role and put on a different hat sometimes. So helping families do that can facilitate that, in family mentorship. But both are important, I think.
And you just mentioned the difference between telling and mentoring. Can you
Yes.
explain that a little further?
Yeah. Well, telling is about you have to do this or you should do this, and this is how it's done. A mentor says, here's how I created success in my role in whatever, in the family or in the business that I've run. And so it's about sharing your success and helping the mentee really think about what does success look like for them, and how do they take that sort of wisdom from the mentor and incorporate it, but they don't necessarily have to do it the same way because their experience may be very different. So it's not about telling, it's about sharing and guiding and helping and listening really to what the mentee is struggling with, and help them find their pathway.
You're right that you have to think beyond the family to build a dynasty.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, it's about focusing on professionalizing. I'm not a big fan of that word, but I hope it makes sense. It's really about formalizing some of the things that are required for a family enterprise to do transition well, which is, sort of putting in good governance and, implementing, sort of a nurturing talent within the family, really appreciating the stronger together sort of mentality and that owner's mindset, and fostering that culture of excellence in sort of the whole family environment, but also within the business itself.
When evaluating outside professional help, what criteria should you apply?
Well, I think there is a lot. There's a great little book which is called How to Use and Hire and Use Advisors. So I think, aside from that book, though, which has great sort of 12 benchmarks, I would say there's a few things. One, which is that there's good fit with family culture. Most important, there needs to be a good fit with family culture. They need to be able to be neutral and to manage their biases, and that they need to work for the common good of the family. Sometimes what I've seen is that outside advisors and outside management tend to align with one part of the shareholder group and not really appreciate that they're working for the whole family and the good of the family. And so finding advisors and professional help, and whether it's maybe internal, management team or advisors that have those qualities, that good fit and that ability to really serve the whole family, and not sort of one part of the shareholder group that they might align with or might have more bias towards.
When family members marry, I heard Kevin Leary of Shark Tank fame say outsiders should sign a prenup, not have any access to the family money. What do you advise?
Well, I actually do sessions on that quite a bit. My husband happens to be a family law lawyer, and so we kind of joke all the time. I'm putting families together and helping them stay together, and he's taking them apart. But I think that it is difficult to talk about prenups. It's people tend to have strong reactions to them. It's when you're, sort of saying your undying love to someone at the same time as you're trying to talk about what you're going to do when you break up. It's a very difficult, there's some dissonance there, but such an important thing because it's not just about you, it's about your family business and your family assets that may have been in your family for generations. And so instead of thinking about it as a prenup, maybe think about it as a family asset protection agreement. And really, given the level of divorce in North America, we do want to make sure that we're protecting our family's assets that have been in our generation, been in families for generation. The thing that we do want to be careful of is that we don't overreach, though, so that the agreement encompasses absolutely everything, because that's also not fair and not workable. And the courts, the justice system isn't going to uphold that either. So finding a good balance there in terms of making sure you're protecting the family's assets, but at the same time you're also being fair to the partner. And your jurisdiction, of course, has a lot to do with what that prenup or marriage agreement is going to look like. So it's going to be specific to your jurisdiction.
I had a family business where two sons were involved,
Mhm.
and both sons got married, but one son got married, and the daughter-in-law got involved in business. And I said to the parents, the daughter-in-law should be the next CEO of the company, and even the brothers agreed. But
Mhm.
the one of the spouses was afraid that what if there was a divorce? Does she end up with the family business?
Right.
And didn't want to give any equity to this person at all.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
said, first of all, you should just sell the business to your kids,
Yeah.
as opposed to giving them the business.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then once you've gotten out of it, let them sort it out
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
between them. So,
Yeah.
but you see these things where like the parents started becoming a lot like the one spouse was totally logical about, but the other one, who was the actual founder, became totally illogical about how this should actually work at the end of the day, even when her kids were agreeing that this was only the fair thing because this person was the most suited to run the company.
Yeah, it's a complex conversation. Again, helping families, getting good advice and talking through if we walk through this doorway, what does that mean in the future in terms of, ownership and how the company gets divided up amongst shareholders in the future. So talking through it and working through it and finding, a good balance again is important.
Uh,
But most important thing is families understand what they're signing when they sign a shareholders agreement about that. Yeah.
along these lines, what do you recommend when an outside spouse has skills and does want to join the family business? What's the next step there?
Well, good having, again, having good family employment policies. So, ideally, before the rising generation gets involved in the family business, you want to think about whether it's spouse or, a blood relative, how do they get hired? Do they have to have outside expertise or experience? Do they need to have education? And then when they, are involved when they apply, do they have an interview? Do they get their, a job just because their last name is, the family last name? How do they get compensated? How do they get promoted? Can they be fired? What are their expectations of their behavior? So all of that is set up before a family member, whether it's a spouse or again, a blood family member gets hired. All of those expectations are set out. And then of course, some accountability needs to be put in place around those. So those are important conversations to set the stage for really effective family employment.
Do you encourage the kids to be part of groups of where other family business owners from other families are together and there's someone who is, running that group? It's almost like a YPO for family businesses,
Sure.
where they're talking about common problems that they all deal with so they don't feel isolated in their own family business.
Oh, yeah, I think peer groups are amazing. And, as I was saying earlier, I think families learn best from each other when we can get families in a room together, magic happens, because you're sort of like with your people, you understand the dilemmas that you face, you understand the complexity, and you share ideas, and and you can feel heard and understood in ways that you don't always with a peer group that doesn't have that experience of being part of a family enterprise. So no, I think those things are invaluable. Absolutely.
When, if at all, which you talk about in the book, bring a psychologist in to work with family members, since the issues are many, since everyone knows all the family members' skeletons and especially their hot buttons.
Yes, all the time. I bring in psychologists. I think that, and therapists. So I think they're very, very helpful to resolve historical impasses in a family, or very deep and, complex dynamics and emotions that they might have. So, sometimes the challenge is finding a specialist that really understands family and family enterprise, because it is a unique creature, right? Because it's not just a family, it has a business component and it has an ownership component. So having people whether they're psychologists or therapists or counselors, really understand that world that they live in, I think can go a long way to help sort of address some of these unresolved conflicts, or some of these big challenging and sensitive issues that families need to talk about.
How do you prepare the founder for actually retiring? Because I remember, this is years ago,
Mhm.
the founder of U-Haul had turned the business over to his sons, and
Yeah.
then he decided he didn't like the way they were running it and tried to reassert himself. And the sons actually had him escorted out of the corporate headquarters
Yeah.
with armed security guards.
I know.
And so, and there was I remember 60 Minutes or 2020 had done a story on this in the United States, and how embarrassing it was for the whole family. And it
Yes.
really called consternation, where the sons were no longer talking to the father.
Yes, I know. I have a family where that's happening right now. It's tragic. It's tragic. I think preparing, again, it's difficult. I mean, these founders have big personalities. They've developed something that they're very proud of, very connected to. It's like a child or their baby, and it's difficult to let go of. And each family is very different and unique in how we help that happen. I think we think about the what we call the sort of the senior generation readiness checklist. Some of the things that we go through that maybe prevent them from letting go is, do they have enough money, sort of to maintain their lifestyle? Do they have an identity beyond just the family business? What's that next identity that they can step into, and that next role? So we talk about not going from something to nothing, but going from something to something. So what's that next role that they might take on? Do they feel the rising generation is ready, or maybe an outside family leader might be necessary? So there's a checklist that we kind of go through to help them think about all of the dimensions of transition, not just the one dimension around, transitioning the role of leadership, but all of these other pieces that are part of readiness for them to step away from that role and step into something different.
How do you get senior members of the family business who have institutional knowledge to continue as contributors in getting the younger generation to see their value? I was always hearing this in these family businesses, and I always found that the kids actually wanted them to stay around, and the parents were always under this impression, or the older generation, that
Yeah.
the younger generation wanted them out, and the younger generation was always like shocked, like no matter what we say to them, they think that we have some alternative, ulterior motive.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
deal with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it varies from family to family. The rising generation feel that they really they want to put their stamp on the business. And so they want to, sort of have the rising generation move on, or the senior generation move on, excuse me. I think in other families, they do appreciate what the knowledge, skill, and capability can bring. Again, it's about having them talk about, how does that transition happen over time? And how do you move the senior generation out of the leadership roles into more of a mentoring role, more of an advisor role, more of an elder role, and provide those opportunities for their input, but again, not necessarily driving it. And that's a nuanced piece, right? So if you've been the decision maker all of this time, and then you're moving into more of a mentor role, you have to learn how to do that well and come up with structures that allow that to happen without them taking over again. So it just, you have to design a process based on the personalities involved. There's not really a one size solution that fits all, unfortunately. Each family is very unique in how we do this, but helping them talk through it and think through what's the stage of exit for the senior generation. And it is staged. It's not like one day you're here and one day you're gone, unless of course there's a death that happens. It's really much more gradual, and designing that gradual exit is important.
One of the things that I had dealt with a few times with family businesses is that the owner had decided that they were going to do an expansion
Mhm.
and that there was going to be a loan involved in this. And they weren't involving the kids or the next generation in the
Yes.
discussions of whether this even made sense or,
Right. Yes.
how, the selection of the bank or any of these things.
Yes.
And the younger generation was like, I don't know that we want to take on more debt here.
Hmm. Hmm.
How do you advise them about that? How to go and handle that so the younger generation feels like they're part of the decision
Yeah.
process and not being railroaded in something that they're going to inherit in terms of that debt.
Right. Well, I'm dealing with this with a family right now where they're um, starting a real estate division in their family enterprise. And as you probably know, real estate development has a lot of risk associated with it, right? It's a very high risk, complex
Yeah.
business to run. And the rising generation in this family is feeling exactly what you're talking about, where they're feeling, geez, is this something we want to do? How do we do this well? What kind of risk? How are we going to manage that risk? And yet they're not actively at the table. And so we're designing how that transition. So we've got, for example, we're moving some of the senior generation members off of the board. We're moving some of the rising generation members onto the board. We're educating the family on, as a whole, on real estate development so they understand those risks. They can talk about those risks. Then we're having not just owners councils meetings, but we're having owner and future owner meetings so that, again, we're getting the rising generation involved in these conversations and helping, but it's slow. It does not happen. Mark, I say families, they don't even work at a snail's pace. They work at a sloth's pace, right? And
Yeah,
it's
glacial.
very, very slow, but that's okay. That's okay. I think there's so much at stake that we need to be patient. We need to work through these things slowly and intentionally so that, the business survives, but more importantly, the family survives. So being really patient, but thoughtful and intentional about how decisions are made and where can we get the rising generation involved, and thinking through that very intentionally, again, very carefully, so that, yeah, over time it happens, but it doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen quickly.
How important is it for family members to rise up through the ranks and report to non-family members and actually have to be under the control of non-family members in terms of whether they move up or not in the organization?
I think that it is incredibly valuable to start in, lower in the organization and learn it. I've families that I've seen who have done that, it has worked incredibly well. And they have those rising generation family members end up having a tremendous amount of credibility. But again, I don't want to put a one size fits all solution in, because in some families, you've got family members who go out, they get educated, they get an MBA, they go work at a large, business in their industry, and they gain tremendous amount of skills, and they can come in at a higher level and they still have that credibility. I think it's when families hire family members that don't necessarily always have the skill, experience, or capability to fit the role, that's when things can be more challenging. So it really depends. But where I have seen families members go up the ranks, I think that it breeds a lot of credibility for them, for sure.
Yingling Beer, which is the oldest beer in the United States,
Mhm.
Dick Yingling, who I believe is still alive, his father and uncle didn't see his value, and so he left the family business and they were around a $2 million business, but never beyond local. And he got a lot of experience in another beer company, and they ended up bringing him back, and he
Yeah.
made it into a national
Yeah.
company.
Right.
And so, how often is it important for the family and the Strawbridge and Clothier family out of Philadelphia? They
Mhm.
made all of their kids work for competitors,
Yeah. Yes.
and the competitors had them work for the Strawbridge
Yeah.
family.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
important is that to get that outside experience before
Oh,
you enter the family business?
it's fantastic. I mean, not all, I mean, it's very funny because not all competitors will take on a family member from another family business that's in their industry. But when they do that, or even just going somewhere else and working, it's where your name doesn't mean anything. So, you're treated like a normal person because
Right.
sometimes in a family business, you're treated like, I have young people that I work with a number of Gen 3 groups, and when they tell me about how they're treated in a family business, they're demigods, in terms of how they're treated. So we don't want that, right? Also, they get to make mistakes and do their bumps and bruises somewhere else because families tend to have a long memory sometimes. And so going somewhere else where you make a mistake, it's not going to stick with your family for generations of, oh yeah, do you remember when Johnny did blah, 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 right? That doesn't exist. And so there's lots of reasons why going and working somewhere else. You're also going and learning another business's sort of operations and how they do things. So you're bringing back valuable expertise and experience. So there's many, many reasons why that's valuable.
And it's funny, when you think about there's so many TV shows based on family businesses
Yes,
that are
yes, there are.
constantly running, and they all become super hit shows
Yes, they
because I think
do.
they're so relatable to people,
Yes,
even if you don't have a family business, all the
yes,
family dynamics. You suggest families develop a book club. Aside
yes,
from your book, what are you
yeah.
suggesting they read and or listen to?
Yeah, well, and there's so many things, right? It's dependent on what they want to learn first and foremost. So when I work with, say, sibling partners or cousin groups, what do they want to learn about? So sometimes it's about, we want to help them learn about their relationship to money. So we might have them read The Psychology of Money, or maybe we want them to read, how to be a good shareholder. So there's a little book that we give to that. Maybe it's about thinking about difficult conversations like death. And so we might have them read a book called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. Sometimes it's about learning how to have difficult conversations. So we might have them read that book. It's really dependent on where they're at, where their energy is. We want them to read something that is relevant to them and is engaging for them. So it depends, but those are some examples of some books that I've had sibling groups and cousin groups read together and then talk about it.
Here's a question from the audience. As a fellow Canadian and recipient of the Eaton Family Fellowship to study in the MBA at Ivy School of Business many years ago, I'm
Mhm.
compelled to ask, the Eaton family in Canada ran the Eaton department store chain, which was once one of the country's most prominent family firms. The
Mhm.
business was founded by Timothy Eaton in 1869 and grew to become a household name. Eaton's faced various challenges and eventually Eaton's filed for bankruptcy protection. This marked the end of the iconic Canadian retailer. Is there a cautionary tale about the owner's mindset you speak to and the need to evolve it to remain relevant?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a little bit of what we were speaking about earlier, but it's about, again, recognizing and doing an environmental scan. What's happening in our industry? What's happening in terms of our demographics, in terms of the marketplace? So being relevant to where the world is going, where your market, where your customers are going, but also dealing with the internal dynamics and, you know, really appreciating what's happening in the family and where you want to go as a family, setting your vision and direction and your values, and then making sure that you're living that and you're honoring that. And so both of those things are important, the family side as well as the business side. And as owners, really setting that direction is important.
How does the leader of the family determine if the family's not capable of running the family business and outside professionals need to be brought in?
Well, I don't know if it's the leader of the family that determines that. I would love to sort of expand that, Mark, and say, how
Sure.
does the family determine if the family's capable? And so thinking about where the family business, where do we want to take this business, this enterprise? What do we want to do with it? So sometimes it might be selling the family business. It might not be maintaining a business. It might be doing something very different, maybe putting, in place a family office. So where do they want to go, and who is best in the rising generation to make this possible, to have this vision realized for and with the family. So it's about the family kind of really being answering that question. Do we want to be a family business? Do we want to work together? If so, why? And what do we want to accomplish together? And each generation needs to ask themselves that question. And then who is the best leader or group of leaders to help us get there? And sometimes that might be internally, and sometimes it might not be internally, it might be external. But the family really collectively working through that, really important, those series of questions, so that they can think about where they want to go as a family and as a business.
When determining what is the best plan to guide a family business, you have a process called the 4 A's. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So the 4 A's, so it's assess, acknowledge, act, and adjust. And the first thing is, where are we at? What are our needs? What are our interests? What are our challenges, both as a family enterprise, and as individuals? So really recognizing that that's part of the first step, is to say, where are we? And then recognizing and appreciating that, owning and transitioning a family enterprise, it is a hugely complex endeavor. As I said, family businesses might be the most common form of business, but they are the most complex form of business. So understanding and keeping that in mind as you traverse this pathway of continuity. Then act. So we've got assess, acknowledge, act is the third, which is don't sit idle, but undertake strategies that help you continue to strengthen, build, and create new capabilities and skills in your family, so that you're able to navigate this journey of continuity, which may or may not be keeping the family business. It may be that you're doing something different. And then of course adjust, and you need to adjust along the way, because new life stages occur, new family members, you've got new spouses that come into the family, you have new children that are born, and so you need to constantly be adjusting and keeping in tune, that big picture level of where your family's at, where you're going as a family enterprise, and adjust along the way based on all of the pieces that are involved in life stage changes.
Lastly, what's the biggest future challenge you see for family businesses that families need to prepare for?
Oh my goodness, that's such a difficult question to answer. I think there's, again, it's the familyness side for sure, is paying attention to the F factor, but it's also about paying attention to these global trends that are happening. Acknowledging technology advancements and climate change and globalization, and thinking about how to cultivate the mindset of innovating and adjusting to those changes that they're facing, and incorporating all of the diversity that's required in a family enterprise as they are traversing. So I think that the most important thing, even within all of those changes that are happening, is paying attention to the family's ability to do three things, which is to communicate well with one another, to make really good decisions together with the right voices in the right decision at the right time, but also to be able to resolve conflict. So if you can do those three things together, you will be able to address and prepare for those global trends, and for all of the complexity that you're going to face as a family.
Wendy, it went too fast. And especially since I love family business, I could have been
Yes.
sitting here all day with you talking about family business, especially
Yeah.
swapping stories. So thank you so much for taking the time. I really think your book is extremely practical and a great guide for anybody. And it brings up lots of questions then, but tons of answers for them so they can run their family business smoothly and not as there's a family business in the Philadelphia area. It's a big family business. And he said that he wants the family to always be able to have Thanksgiving and Christmas together. And
Yes.
the minute that didn't happen, then
Yeah.
then you're gone from the business. So if you had to bring that anger and animosity to the family events, you were
Right.
gone.
Interesting. Well, wonderful. Well, and those are good, good principles to have, right? And Marc, I just want to say thank you so much for having our book, sort of featured here and being with you and having this conversation. It's been delightful, and it's nice to meet you and get to know you a little bit and hear your experiences too. So thanks so much for having us here.
Well, you and I will definitely stay in contact because of our
Yeah,
mutual interest.
that would be
Have a
great.
good weekend, everyone. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.
Thanks so much.